Richard was momentarily speechless, processing the situation. The word abduction echoed in his mind like a hammer. He was aware that he had made an impulsive decision by bringing those children to his home, but he never imagined anyone would accuse him of something so serious. His first instinct was to be outraged, but he quickly realized that showing anger would only make things worse. Detective Harris Richard began striving to remain calm. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I found those children on the street last night, abandoned and in danger. I just wanted to help them." Sarah Carter, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. "We understand your concern. Mr. Marlowe, we need to verify the facts. May we see the children?" Richard nodded, his mind working frantically to find the best way to handle the situation. He knew the police weren't there to listen to his version of events. They were there to ensure the children were safe. Mrs. Thompson, who had been watching from a distance, stepped in. "Sir, if I may, I'll take the detectives to the children. They're fine." "I assure you, Mr. Marlowe only tried to do the right thing." Harris looked at her with an inscrutable expression before nodding. "Take us to them, please." As Mrs. Thompson led the detectives toward the dining room, Richard followed closely. Feeling a mix of nervousness and helplessness, he knew things could quickly turn against him if he didn't. Managed to prove that he had acted with good intentions entering the dining room, he found Tommy and the baby. Just as he had left them, the baby was in the high chair playing with a spoon, while Tommy watched with a protective expression. Tommy looked up when the detectives entered, and Richard noticed a flicker of fear in his eyes. The boy didn't move, but he visibly tensed as if bracing for the worst. Richard felt a pang of pain in his chest as he realized that despite Tommy's apparent calm, the boy was terrified of what might happen. "This is Tommy and the baby. I'm not sure of his name," Richard explained, feeling Harris's scrutinizing gaze. Gazing on him, "I found them last night huddled on the street. I don't know anything more about them, only that they were in a dangerous situation." Sarah approached Tommy, kneeling down to be at his level. "Hello, Tommy," she said softly, trying not to frighten him. "What's your name, and what's your little brother's name?" Tommy looked at Sarah with distrust, but didn't answer. He simply pressed his lips together and turned his gaze toward the baby. The gesture was so eloquent that no words were needed. Sarah exchanged a glance with Harris, who nodded slightly. "We understand that you're scared, Tommy," Sarah continued patiently. "We just want to make sure you and your brother are okay. Can you tell us anything about what happened?" Tommy's silence was an answer in itself. Richard felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck. He knew that the boy's silence could be interpreted as a sign that something was wrong. The detectives seemed to think the same, and the tension in the room grew. Finally, Mrs. Thompson broke the silence. "Detective Harris, Detective Carter. I was the one who helped Mr. Marlowe bring these children inside. I can assure you that he only tried to protect them. I saw with my own eyes how they were when he found them. They had no one. They were alone and scared." Harris looked at Mrs. Thompson, evaluating the situation. "We don't doubt what you're saying, Mrs. Thompson," he finally said, though his tone wasn't entirely convincing. "But we need to do our job. The children will need to remain under care while we investigate further." Richard felt a momentary relief, but it was short-lived. He knew this was far from over. The detectives had made it clear that their presence at the mansion wasn't just to ensure the children's safety, but also to uncover if there was something more to the story that Richard wasn't telling. "Could the children stay here while you investigate?" Richard asked, trying to maintain his composure. "I don't want them to go through any more stress." Harris considered this for a moment before responding. "For now, yes. But you must understand, this isn't a final resolution. We will continue investigating." Sarah stood up and looked at Richard with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mr. Marlowe, this is an unusual case. We appreciate your cooperation, but there are still many unanswered questions. We'll be in touch." Richard nodded, knowing that his life, already disrupted by the arrival of the children, was about to become even more complicated. The police weren't going to let this go, and every move he made would be watched and scrutinized. As the detectives left, Richard stood at the door watching as the police cars drove down the long driveway. He felt a knot in his stomach. He had done what he believed was right, but now he was trapped in a situation that could spiral out of control at any moment. Returning inside, he found Tommy sitting in the same spot, watching the baby. Richard approached and sat down beside him, feeling an urgent need to Connect with the boy to make him understand that he was there to help. I won't let them hurt you, he said quietly, more to himself than to Tommy. We'll find a way through this, I promise. Tommy didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Richard knew in that moment that the promise he had just made wasn't only for Tommy, but also for himself. And somehow, he would have to find a way to keep it, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The following days at the Marlowe mansion were marked by a heavy and uncertain atmosphere. Richard tried to maintain a facade of calm, but inside his mind was in constant turmoil. The almost daily presence of detectives, Harris and Sarah Carter, only heightened his anxiety. He knew his life was under constant scrutiny, and every question they asked, every detail they investigated brought them closer to a truth he would rather keep hidden. Tommy, for his part, remained as reserved as ever. Although Richard tried to get closer to the boy, his efforts seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier. Tommy didn't say much, but he observed everything around him with keen eyes, as if constantly evaluating his surroundings and the people around him. Richard was beginning to realize that despite his young age, Tommy had experienced things that had forced him to grow up faster than normal. One afternoon, while Richard was working in his study, Sarah knocked on the door. He had seen her several times over the past few days, but this time he noticed something different in her expression. There was a mix of determination and compassion that put him on alert. Mr. Marlowe, may we talk? Sarah asked, entering the study with a folder under her arm. Richard nodded and leaned forward, preparing for whatever she was about to reveal. Sarah sat down in front of him, and after a brief silence, she opened the folder and pulled out some documents. We've been investigating the children's past, but we've also reviewed your history. Mr. Marlowe, Sarah began, her voice firm but not accusatory, and we found something I believe you need to know. Richard felt a knot in his stomach. He knew this moment would come sooner or later, but he wasn't prepared to face it. What did you find? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Years ago, you were involved in a fierce business competition with a man named Victor Harov, Sarah continued, wasting no time. We know that competition ended disastrously for him. Harrow lost everything, his company, his fortune, and his family. He disappeared off the radar after that, and we've discovered that he spent some time abroad before secretly returning to the country. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, letting the name resonate in his mind. Harov. It was a name he hadn't spoken in years, but one that had left an indelible mark on his life. The competition with Harov had been brutal. Richard had used every trick in the book to destroy his rival and secure his own success. At the time, he hadn't stopped to think about the personal consequences for Harov, but now all of it was coming back to him with unsettling clarity. Are you suggesting these children are connected to Harov? Richard asked, opening his eyes and fixing them on Sarah. We can't say for certain, but there are too many coincidences to ignore more. Sarah replied, Harov didn't disappear completely, Mr. Marlowe. He reinvented himself under a false name, and according to our investigations, he's been watching your movements for years, waiting for the right moment to. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. Richard looked at her intently, understanding what she was implying. To get revenge, he finished. Sarah nodded slowly. It's a possibility we can't rule out. Children could be part of that plan. The impact of those words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. He stood up from his chair and began pacing the study, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just discovered. Harov, a man he had mercilessly destroyed, had returned to make him pay the price. And now those children, whom Richard had begun to see as his responsibility, were caught in the middle of a revenge scheme that should never have happened. What are you going to do about it? He finally asked, stopping to look at Sarah. We're delving deeper into Hargrove's life, trying to track every move he's made since he returned to the country, she replied. But the most troubling thing is that Hargrove seems to have vanished again, just as we were closing in on the truth. This leads us to believe that he's on the move, and his next target could be you. Richard felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. He couldn't allow Harrov to harm those children or anyone else. He had spent too long ignoring the consequences of his actions, but now, reality had caught up with him in the most brutal way possible. Tommy knows something. Richard said, more to himself than to Sarah. I see it in his eyes. He's keeping a secret, and I think it has to do with Harrov. Sarah nodded, but her expression grew serious. That's likely, but we can't push him too hard. The boy has already been through so much. We need his trust to get to the truth, not his fear. Richard knew she was right, But he also knew that time wasn't on their side. If Harrov was really behind all this, he could make his move at any moment. Richard needed to protect those children, and to do that, he would have to uncover the truth no matter how painful it was. That night, as he walked through the mansion's hallways, Richard felt as if a dark shadow was following him. Memories of his competition with Hargrove haunted him, mingling with images of Tommy and the baby. He had been ruthless, relentless in his pursuit of success, but now those actions from the past had come back to torment him. He stopped in front of the door to the room where the children were sleeping. He opened the door carefully and saw Tommy awake, curled up next to the baby, who was sleeping peacefully. The soft light of a lamp illuminated the room, and Richard felt a pang of pain as he saw the expression on Tommy's face, a mixture of sadness and determination that shouldn't belong to a child so young. "Tommy," he said quietly, entering the E-room, "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But I want you to know that I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Do you trust me?" Tommy looked up at Richard, and for a moment it seemed like he was going to say something, but he stopped. Instead, he nodded slowly without saying a word. Richard approached and sat on the bed, resting her hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know you're carrying a heavy burden, and it's not fair," Richard continued, his voice laden with emotion, "but you don't have to carry it alone. I'm here to help you, to protect you, whatever you're holding inside. You don't have to face it by yourself." Tommy looked at him, and for the first time Richard saw a flicker of something beyond distrust in his eyes. Perhaps it was hope, or maybe just the recognition that he wasn't alone anymore. Either way, Richard felt that he had taken a small step toward gaining the trust he so desperately wanted. That night, Richard left the door to the room slightly ajar, as he left as a sign that he was there for the children, ready for whatever might come. He knew that the battle against the ghosts of his past had just begun, and that he would need all the strength and determination to protect the children from the shadows looming over them in the depths of the night as the mansion sank into silence. Richard realized that for the first time in his life, he had something more to protect than his wealth. He had those children, and with them a chance at redemption that he couldn't afford to lose. The days continued to be filled with tension at the Marlowe mansion. Richard tried to maintain his composure as the detective's investigation intensified, but inside the pressure was mounting. He knew that time was running out, and that the threat of Viktor Harrov loomed over them like a sinister shadow. However, what Richard didn't suspect was that the danger was much closer than he imagined. One afternoon, while Richard was working in his study, he received an unexpected call from Detective Sarah Carter. Her voice, usually calm, had a note of urgency that put Richard on alert. "Mr. Marlowe, I need to speak with you. It's important," Sarah said without preamble. Richard felt something dark stirring in his stomach. "I'm in my study. You can come by whenever you want." It wasn't long before Sarah arrived at the mansion. Her expression was grave, and Richard immediately knew that things had taken an unexpected turn. He invited her to sit, but she remained standing as if the situation was too urgent to allow for comfort. "We found something," Sarah began, looking Richard directly in the eyes. "Something I didn't expect, but it explains a lot." Richard remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "During our investigation, we've been monitoring the movements of everyone in the mansion, not just yours." She explained that a couple of days ago we noticed that Mrs. Thompson, your housekeeper, has been acting suspiciously. This morning we found conclusive evidence that leads us to believe she has been in contact with Viktor Harrov for some time. Sarah's words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. Mrs. Thompson, the woman he had trusted for years, was betraying him. It felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "What kind of evidence?" he managed to ask, his voice tense. Sarah pulled out a small recording device and placed it on the desk. "We intercepted a phone call between Mrs. Thompson and someone we believe is Harrov. The conversation reveals that she has been providing information about you and the children. Harrov manipulated her using an old debt she had, threatening her with consequences if she didn't cooperate." Richard felt a mix of anger and betrayal that took his breath away. He had trusted Mrs. Thompson and considered her almost like part of the family, and now he discovered that she had been working against him from the beginning. "I can't believe this," he murmured, his mind spinning with the new information. "She betrayed me all this time." Sarah nodded seriously. "We don't know the full extent of her involvement, but it's clear that her loyalty was bought by Hargrove. We need to confront her, but I wanted you to know before we proceed." Richard stood up, trying to control the anger boiling inside him. "Take me to her. I want to hear from her own mouth why she did this." Sarah led him to the servants' wing of the mansion, where Mrs. Thompson was in her room when they arrived. They found her hurriedly packing a suitcase as if she were ready to flee when she saw Richard and Sarah at the door. Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted from surprise to fear. "Mr. Marlowe," she began to say, but the words caught in her throat. "Why?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "Why did you betray me after all these years? How could you do this, especially to the children?" Mrs. Thompson lowered her head, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I had no choice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Harov. He knew things about me, things that could ruin me. He threatened me and forced me to do it. I never wanted to hurt you, sir. I never wanted it to go this far." Richard felt his rage mixed with a deep sadness. Although he understood that Hargrove had manipulated her, the betrayal was still painful. "What made you think that betraying me and betraying these children was the only option?" he asked, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what she had done. "I was afraid," she responded, lifting her gaze to meet Richard's eyes. "But when I saw those children, I knew." Wait for the third episode.